Have you ever been in a discussion where you're trying to make an important point about the state of American democracy, and then someone else, either in the chat or, off to one side, decides to butt in and say, well, actually, we're a republic, we're not a democracy? Now, I know a lot of you already know that this is sort of the classic dumb guy trying to sound like a smart guy argument. It's a lot like Man Bear Pig was for global warming for a while, where it allows someone to say something that destroys the conversation without having to actually say anything about what they're for or risk saying something that might be unpopular. Now, if someone's in this headspace, it's really unlikely that you're going to be able to get them to think another way, deconstruct their argument with them, and convince them otherwise. But if you kind of know a little bit about it, you can prevent it from ruining the conversation that you're having. And so the first question is, where does this all come from? And the kind of originator of this argument is America's first dumb guy who was trying to sound smart, Alexander Hamilton. I'm not going to sing it. But in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton puts forward this argument about the difference between the Athenian democracy and the Roman Republic or Venetian republicanism or what have you. And he does it in such a way that kind of hedges on a lot of the points about the relevancy of the two different systems and how it applies to his argument. But really what he's trying to do here is he's trying to reassure the ruling class of the colonies who had just participated in this war and were kind of nervous about Shays' Rebellion and all the things that were going on around them, kind of reassure them that the government that was being created by the Constitution wasn't going to descend into mob rule. And so he uses this framework as a way of expressing that idea. But from there, you would think that the distinction between democracy and republic, since that goes all the way back to our founding, that distinction would be with us for all time from that point on. Not really. The Jeffersonian faction in the early days of the country was called the Democratic Republicans. Now, granted, it didn't have an official nomenclature. Some people would just say Republicans, but a lot of people would say Democratic Republicans, or they would use the two names for the party, Republican and Democratic Republican, pretty much interchangeably. There wasn't much of a difference that was seen between the two. And then later, when the Jacksonian Democrats come along, the oppositional faction to the Jacksonian Democrats doesn't call themselves the Republicans because they're trying to create this dichotomy between these two different systems of thought. No, they call themselves the Whigs because they're trying to invoke the anti-monarchical party from the UK because they think that Andrew Jackson is being a tyrant. In some ways, he kind of was usurping his authority. It's not the argument I want to have right here. But they didn't just automatically spring over and say, democracy bad, we are calling ourselves Republicans because America was founded to be a republic. From that point on, this argument kind of goes away for a little while. Doesn't really reemerge at all until just after the American Civil War. After the American Civil War, we kind of see this fervor for reform. And it goes beyond just the amendments that were passed, just abolition, just Reconstruction. You see a lot of people want to make some really fundamental changes to our government that would help empower a lot of these men who had just fought in this war and for the first time had gotten a real sense of their own power if they banded together. So they wanted to abolish the Senate, or at least make some serious changes to it. They wanted to change the executive branch. They wanted to change the judiciary. And not long after the war, there was an internal realignment in the Republican Party. I covered this in one of my videos, the one, when did the Republicans stop being the party of Lincoln? But to make a long story short, after the war, the conservative faction of the party and the pro-business and pro-industrialist faction of the party kicked out the radical Republicans. And then the battles of the Gilded Age were kind of between what used to be the radical Republican faction, becoming the Greenbacks and the Populists and various other things at different points, and the populist Democrats and the business interests that were all aligned with the Republican Party, very heavily aligned with them. And they didn't want to have to make an unpopular elitist argument, but they also didn't want to have an argument. They just wanted to call on the Pinkertons to, get rid of the problem. So they too would make these sort of, oh, we're a republic, not a democracy type of arguments to kill the discussion. It comes back after the end of the Gilded Age. We get into Teddy Roosevelt, but then this comes back again during the New Deal era. For a very long time, no one was talking about this. And then during the New Deal era, the same kind of interests within our government, the kind of ruling class and the ruling elite and the financiers and the business folks and everything else like that, they don't like the New Deal. So they turn to this argument from an intellectual standpoint that, well, actually, the founders said that we're a republic, we're not a democracy. And, so therefore they can make an argument against all this economic democratization, racial democratization, social democratization, governmental democratization, and all this expansion of representation and thought about what our government is. They can make that argument without having to resort themselves to what may be an unpopular argument. So again, it is a shutting down the discussion type of thing while they get along to the actual business of undermining the New Deal. So wait for that motorcycle to pass. It was a lot louder here earlier. That's why this is the first video I've made in a while. So from that point, where are we? And I think the thing to remember is that prior to any of this, we have plenty of political figures and politicians throughout our history who use the words our republic or the republic to describe our country, while they use democracy to describe our system. And so if you look at Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln, one of his most famous quotes is, "As I would not be a slave, so too would I not be a master. This expresses my ideal of democracy. Whatever differs from this to the extent of the difference is no democracy." He's saying that before the Civil War even breaks out. So, this idea that there is this vast tradition in American history where these two things were seen as separate doesn't hold up to any reality. It's not true. So the person hearing this, if you get this far, may say, well, yeah, but, what I mean. What I mean is that we are not, we're not a direct democracy. We're not like Athens. We have Burkean-style representatives who make the best decisions with kind of controlled input from the people, like the Roman Republic. Where are you pulling this out of? Again, other than this Hamiltonian argument about the differences between the two. So if we're going to give this any credence at all whatsoever, where does this come from? Going back to Hamilton, as I said, he was trying to create a framework to present his argument. The idea is that Athens was direct democracy, which is the bad thing, apparently, too much representation. And we can see that because of what happened to Socrates. But only about 10% of the adult male population in Athens had the vote at any given time. The pool of voters was so small and so restricted to the governing elite of the city and the ruling class that it might as well have just been a legislature. You only had about 500 people who voted in Socrates' trial. So there wasn't a point to electing representatives. There wasn't a point doing any of this. The elite were in charge anyway, and they made laws for everybody else. That's not very representative. That's not very what we think of when we say democratic, is it? So I'm sorry, I just realized I had forgotten to mention this earlier, and it's pretty important. Given what we know about the limited franchise in Athens, remember I said it's about 10% of the adult male population, and given what we know about the reasons that Socrates was put on trial and then put to death, mainly that people were worried that his mockery of the institutions and the electorate of Athens would lead to unrest, doesn't it seem like this is actually really a cautionary tale about there being too much elite rule and not enough democratic oversight? I know it's historically been told the other way around, but, that's because historically it's been educated elite people who are reading these stories. If you actually look at it from what we know now, from our perspective of how political power works and how democracies work and everything else like that, sounds a lot more like it's actually not a tale about too much democracy or excessive democracy. It's a tale about not enough democracy. But anyway, I just wanted to get that in. Meanwhile, Rome, yes, was also had some problems with representation, to be sure. But depending upon what period you're talking about, in its 400-year history, the Roman Republic generally had about 20% to 40% of the male population, the adult male population, having the vote, the franchise at any given time. And so because of that, their government was naturally much more representative. So, okay, fine. We have this other term, commonwealth. So we have democracy, demos, krasi, will, the rule of, will of the people. Then we have res publica, which means the people's thing, which also basically translates to the will of the people. And then we have the word in English, commonwealth, which common, the public, wealth at that time that the word was derived meant like well-being, not money. It meant well-being, for the well-being of the people. So you have these three words that basically mean exactly the same thing. Why isn't Hamilton talking about Commonwealth? Well, because Commonwealth became associated with Cromwell. And while a lot of states did call themselves Commonwealths, it had kind of a negative connotation. So, Hamilton avoided that. It had a negative connotation to some people and a positive connotation to other people, I should say. So Hamilton conveniently doesn't talk about the English form of democracy, which of course is where we're actually deriving a lot of this. State legislatures mostly had upper houses and lower houses. A lot of people had the right to vote before the revolution even happened. So these systems are coming from that. Hamilton doesn't want to talk about that. He wants to create this high-minded framework that also reassures the powerful in the colonies that their power is not going to be usurped without having to make the unpopular argument. And so we get back to why is this happening now? Why are we back here at this place that we're at now, where of course people are saying, well, you're concerned about our democratic process and our democratic norms and people's democratic will. Well, we're a republic. We're not a democracy. And of course, it's the SAVE Act. That's one of the biggest reasons why this is coming up again. And I don't think it's any mystery to anybody that regardless of the arguments that are being made, the point of the SAVE Act is to limit the franchise. And of course, limit the franchise from whom? Who are we taking this away from? Who are we taking representation away from? And that's the thing that they don't want to just come out and admit, unless, of course, they're on their own internet forums or, they're watching Nick Fuentes or whatever, and then they openly admit it, openly and proudly admit that they are for removing the franchise from women, from minorities, et cetera, et cetera. Fuentes is actually kind of a bad example. Probably like Ben Shapiro would be a better example. But point being that they're pretty open about it there. And so when people are trying to make these conversation killer arguments about, well, we're a republic, not a democracy, I am the big brain, therefore your argument is invalid, ask them, okay, so what do you mean by that? What is it about democracy, the concept of democracy that you don't like and being democratic? What is it that you don't like about representation? You don't like that the government's too representative? Well, who do you think it should be less representative of? And make them defend that point. Make them have to make their own argument. Either they're going to get out of there and then you can go on with the conversation that you were having, or they're going to say something that's going to lose them an audience, in which case you win. So that's my recommendation. Go out there and know that these people, as I said, I know a lot of people know that this is a dumb guy's argument before, but it's actually even more baseless than you think. Even if you're the type of person who gives a hoot and holler about these arguments about, what the founders intended, that are almost always made in bad faith, this is a particularly baseless argument. So, the weather has not been particularly cooperative lately. And also there's some construction that's going on next door because there's basically like a ruin next to my house that should be condemned or should be sold off. But the owner, for whatever reason, doesn't want to do either of those. And so periodically he does work on it so the city won't condemn it. And the last week with the nicer weather has been one of those time periods. So I always have either one of those things going on. That being said, I'm working on a bigger video and bigger and more cinematic, there we go, that's what I was looking for, than a lot of my prior videos have been. But I have to work with what reality is willing to work with in the time that I have. So I have a bunch of these smaller topics piled up that I'm also going to work on, and so this is just the first one that I'm going to do. But if you liked this, or if you have any better ideas for arguments that could be made than what I presented, or if you think that I am an idiot and you want to argue with me, you can also comment. I'm happy to take those comments as well, but please like, comment, and subscribe. I look forward to making more of these again in the future. So take care, everybody.